Hi doll! Hey YouTube! Remember the swap video unboxing I did a few weeks ago? Today I'm making the doll. The swap was to make a fantasy or mythical creature, and I'm quite excited about everyone's dolls. Links to their social media in the description. And without further ado, let's start! So for my doll I'm going to do Siren. Not the mermaid type of siren though, the half woman half bird type. I was inspired by the sirens from my favorite game, Legend of Mana. I'm using the G1 Laguna Blue I got in my swap box for this project, and I start by removing her head and hair. Then I wipe off all the paint from the head using acetone, being careful not to damage the head, but trying to make sure all of the paint is gone, although there was a bit of staining around her eyes from her face paint. I remove all of the fins and webbings from her hands and arms and sanding it smooth. I'm also removing the text from her lower back and some seam lines with my X-Acto knife. Since the pose of the right hand wasn't what I wanted, I made a cut between the middle finger and pointing finger to position one of the fingers into a more elegant pose, which I glued in place with super glue. Then I put wires into her head to make an armature for her feather ears, which I sculpt with epoxy putty. Then I paint the scalp pink, the same color as the hair I'm rerouting her with. Then, after that's dry, I root the head with some Kanekalon fiber from some braiding hair, which I cut and straightened. After the hair was rooted, I drown the inside of the head with fabric glue and I leave her out to dry. And that took a while. People always talk about the leaving to dry overnight, but in my experience the head takes way longer to dry. Then I cut off her legs at her calves for some body mods, as well as making some cuts in her heels for toes, for some claws later. I originally took a while to decide what exactly I wanted to make for this project, but I definitely wanted to do some body mods. So I'm using tongue depressor sticks to make new joints on her legs, and using wire and super glue to attach the sticks to her legs. I made the terrible decision to make the holes for the bolts afterwards instead of first, so it was a bit of a struggle, especially since the wood wanted to constantly split, so I made a tiny hole and sanded the hole bigger. For the toes and claws, I put my pieces of coffee stirrer sticks into the grooves I made, then using a 1mm drill bit to drill through the toe pieces and the plastic before putting a wire through and gluing the wire in place. And voila, posable toes. My only problem was that one of my toes wasn't deep enough into the foot to properly catch the wire, so the wood split and I had to glue the toe in place. Then I attached the bolts and nuts following the Lightfalls methods for all her dragon dolls. Next, I grab my epoxy putty and do the first pass over and cover up all the holes, making sure the joints can still move properly. Second pass, I do the toes and add details, trying to make feathers, which is surprisingly difficult. Also blending the abrupt cut in the legs. I also use the excess putty to thicken her thighs. Then continuing with the details, I do the scoots on the legs. It took a while and my epoxy started getting hard before I was done. So some of them were a bit messy, which I fixed with some sanding later. Off screen, I drilled a hole in her backside and added a wire for a tail in the future. And now I'm adding epoxy to it to strengthen the connection and adding epoxy to the torso for a feather texture. My original plan was a full outfit, but I decided on a feather bodice instead. I'm also sculpting a kind of a plateau for her wings and a place to hide the connection with her future tail feathers. After all the sculpting was done, it's time for paint. Starting with her legs, hands and arms, trying to get the same color as the original skin tone, and adding highlights with a slightly lighter color. One of the fabrics I got was this pretty pink, purple and blue tie-dye type fabric, which I tried to replicate in the gradient of her feathers on her legs and ears and torso. By the way, I suck at color matching and doing gradients. Off screen, I carefully covered the joints in super glue to help prevent paint rubbing off, and sealing everything with my Citadel Munitonium varnish sealant. I noticed Laguna has a yellowish, almost pearl shine to her skin, so I used some yellow shiny pigment powder to try and tint the painted parts of her skin the same. It worked a lot better on the legs than the arms though. Then I covered all her feathers in a pearlescent white pigment to help my gradient before sealing again. Next, the tail. I'm going for a large peacock-like tail. I made several patterns for the different layers. I have 2 layers of the dye fabric, which I use to sandwich the wire for the tail in between, which I did with a spray-on adhesive, and I glued the base beneath the feathers on her butt. Then I added 2 layers of glitter tulle beneath the main tail, gluing it only on the base, which I glued the wrong way. Then I layer some purple, blue tulle, pink and pink tulle fabric on top and glued that to the base of the tail. Then I move on to the outfit. Since I decided to have a feather bodice. I forgo a top. And I started with a bolero jacket type thing with huge sleeves. I sewed the two fronts together, then add the back pieces at the shoulders, then the collar after sewing up the top hem, then the sleeves, then I add a tulle ruffle to the sleeves and sew the side seams. Finish the edge of the back and add velcro. Next, the skirt. I layer tulle on the pieces before sewing on side pieces to the front center piece. Then I fold over and sew the top hem wide enough to insert an elastic before sewing the elastic loop closed. I did not finish the other hems, and I used a mixture of steaming and strategic stitches to shape the front to her legs. Onto the wings. I made a frame of colored popsicle sticks and added that to her back on hinges, which is actually super finicky, especially since the hinges are a bit loose. Then I layer on fabrics similar to how I did for her tail, just fewer layers to keep the weight down. Then inspiration came from the Siren from Legend of Mana, and I cover her wings in flowers, also hiding all the ugly bits. Then I add some flowers to parts of her outfit to decorate. I found these nail art stuff in a box and thought they work quite well with her design and added them. Then I added some plastic rhinestones to everything. I also added some hard gems onto the big tail feathers, thinking it will make a peacock-like pattern, along with the rhinestones. Next, the face up. I'm using Citadel Munitonium varnish for this project, and I start off with a few coats of spray, and after that's properly dry, I confidently start sketching out the eye shapes with black. Sorry about the cable in the way. Then I do the eyebrows in pink and blue for the irises. On my second layer, I build up color and define details. I use a kneaded eraser to reduce some color or erase or shape some lines. Layer 3. I continue darkening and defining the colors. Then, using some pastels, I add blush all around her face and color to the lips and some eyeshadow. On the fourth layer, I start adding white paint to the sclera and eye shines, since my white pencils have no way. I also darken the pastels and add some blue pencils for shadows on the eyes, on the sclera. I also repeat the pearl process on her ear feathers like I did on her body and give her face a bit of the yellow sparkle powder. Onto the hair. Unfortunately, I wasn't recording during the curling process, but it's the bobby pin and stole method with boiling water. I wanted to go out of my comfort zone with some super curly hair, but it's already a challenge to keep it neat. I carefully put her head on back after the curlers were removed. I thought her head needed something, so off screen I gave her a headband with flowers on it. In hindsight, I wish I had shrunk her head because it takes a lot of attention away from all the other details. But she's done, and I think I'll call her Aria, since it both has the meaning of air, since she can fly, and is a type of song. And she's a siren, so she sings. And here she is in all her beauty. And please remember to watch or take a look at the other dolls in the collab. Because of reasons we ended up not being able to upload all at the same time. Links in the description. Some are videos and some are pics on Instagram.